sitting near the window instead. "James, what can you tell us about Martin Luther King's leadership during the Civil Rights Movement?" she asked, her voice softening slightly, as if reserving encouragement for select students. James fumbled through an answer, clearly unprepared. Despite his hesitation, Miss Carson nodded approvingly and added, "Good effort. It's important to recognize the context of his work." Her words and tone reinforced a clear double standard, though most in the room wouldn't have called it out. Daniel lowered his hand slowly, a pang of frustration simmering within him. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked by a teacher. Still, it stung. He glanced around and noticed a few classmates exchanging subtle looks, some amused, others sympathetic. Miss Carson moved on with her lesson, continuing to call on students selectively, steering the conversation in a way that subtly minimized the true struggle and contributions of African Americans during that era. When discussing protests and sit-ins, she framed them as disruptive acts that, while effective, raised questions about appropriate methods for change. Daniel clenched his fists under his desk. He wanted to speak, to challenge her perspective, but he knew doing so could backfire. This wasn't just about history. It was about how Miss Carson saw him, saw people like him, and how that shaped the environment she fostered in the classroom. Finally, unable to stay silent, Daniel raised his hand again. This time he spoke without waiting to be acknowledged. "Excuse me, Miss Carson, but don't you think it's important to highlight that those disruptive acts were necessary because peaceful requests for change were ignored for so long? The civil rights movement wasn't just about inconvenience, it was about survival and dignity." The room went silent. Miss Carson's expression hardened, her icy stare locking onto Daniel. "Mr. White," she said, her tone clipped, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, this is a structured discussion. Perhaps you should take some time to listen before making assumptions." Daniel felt the weight of her words, but he refused to shrink under her gaze. "I'm not assuming, Miss Carson. I'm just pointing out that the narrative matters. If we downplay the struggles, we risk erasing the very reasons change was needed in the first place." A murmur rippled through the class. Some students were clearly impressed by Daniel's courage, while others seemed to relish the tension. Miss Carson's jaw tightened, but she forced a brittle smile. "That's an interesting perspective," she said. "However, let's stick to the curriculum." Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. But the fire in his eyes didn't dim. He knew he had made his point, even if Miss Carson dismissed it. For the first time, a crack appeared in her carefully constructed authority, a sign that Daniel wasn't going to be an easy target. As the lesson continued, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted. Some students began to engage more critically, emboldened by Daniel's willingness to speak up. Miss Carson, however, seemed more guarded, her words sharper, and her gaze lingering longer on Daniel, as if assessing him anew. By the time the bell rang, Daniel felt a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. He had taken a stand, however small, against the subtle but pervasive prejudice that Miss Carson represented. As he gathered his things, a classmate leaned over and whispered, "That was brave. Don't let her get to you." Daniel smiled faintly. He wasn't here to fight every battle, but he also wasn't going to let anyone silence him. The challenges ahead would be tough, but he was ready to face them, with his head held high and his voice unwavering. Uneasy, while others smirked, entertained by the brewing conflict. Daniel, maintaining his composure, slowly shook his head and replied, "I'm not chewing gum, Miss Carson." The class fell silent, the tension palpable. Miss Carson's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression one of disbelief, or perhaps irritation at being contradicted. "Are you arguing with me, Daniel?" she asked, her voice icy and patronizing. "I think I know what I see." Daniel's heart pounded, but he met her gaze evenly. "I'm not arguing, Miss Carson. I'm just stating the truth. I'm not chewing gum." A few students exchanged glances, sensing the unfairness of the situation. Some whispered quietly, their words too faint to hear. Miss Carson's face flushed slightly, but she quickly masked it with an air of authority. "Perhaps you think you're above the rules, Daniel," she said, her tone sharper now. "But let me make one thing clear. This classroom has no room for disruptions or dishonesty." Daniel inhaled deeply, willing himself to stay calm. "With respect, Miss Carson, I'm neither disrupting nor being dishonest. I'm here to learn, just like everyone else." The room grew even quieter. Some students appeared impressed by Daniel's restraint, while others seemed stunned by his willingness to stand his ground. Miss Carson, however, was not ready to relent. "This isn't up for debate," she said curtly. "Since you're so insistent, I suggest you step outside and think about how to properly conduct yourself in my classroom." For a moment, Daniel considered arguing further, but he knew it would only escalate the situation. Without a word, he stood, picked up his bag, and walked out of the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the now muted classroom. Outside, Daniel leaned against the wall, gripping the strap of his bag tightly. He felt anger and frustration bubbling inside him, but also a quiet resolve. He wouldn't let this break him. He had faced challenges like this before, and he would face them again. Inside the classroom, the students remained quiet, the tension thick. Miss Carson returned to her lesson, though her words seemed less steady than before. It was clear to some that her attempt to exert control over Daniel hadn't gone as smoothly as she had intended. As the lesson dragged on, a few students began to fidget, their focus drifting from the subject matter to the unspoken drama hanging in the air. Some felt sympathy for Daniel, others felt a growing discomfort with Miss Carson's overt targeting of him. For Daniel, the battle wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about proving day by day that he wouldn't be silenced, no matter how many obstacles were thrown his way. Of the class, some stumbling nervously through their slides, others speaking with confidence but lacking depth. Miss Carson offered polite but superficial feedback to most, her demeanor cold and detached. When it was Daniel's turn, a quiet hush fell over the room. Daniel walked to the front with his materials in hand, his step steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. He placed his notes on the podium, took a deep breath and began. His voice was calm and clear, but his words carried conviction. The civil rights movement wasn't just about fighting segregation, Daniel started. It was about demanding the basic human dignity that had been denied to African Americans for centuries. It was a movement built on courage, resilience, and the belief that equality is not negotiable. As he spoke, the classroom seemed to transform. Daniel presented detailed examples, highlighted key figures and events, and tied them to broader themes of justice and humanity. He didn't shy away from uncomfortable truths, addressing the systemic racism that had persisted both during and after the movement. His passion and knowledge were undeniable. The students listened intently, some leaning forward in their seats. Even Sarah, who had been silently supportive, now wore an expression of awe. A few students who had mocked Daniel before looked uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs. It was clear that Daniel's words were reaching everyone, cutting through the tension that had clouded the classroom for weeks. Miss Carson, however, sat stiffly at her desk, her expression unreadable. She tapped her pen against her notebook, clearly searching for a flaw to point out. When Daniel finished, the room erupted in tentative applause, something that hadn't happened for any other presentation. Daniel stepped back, his hands trembling slightly, but he kept his head high. He had said what needed to be said, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that moment away from him. Miss Carson stood, her face tight. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice clipped. "While your presentation was passionate, I believe you may have ventured into overly subjective territory. This is a history class, not a platform for personal opinions." The applause faded, and the room went silent again. Daniel felt the sting of her words, but he refused to let them diminish his pride in his work. He met Miss Carson's gaze and replied evenly. History is shaped by the voices of those who lived it. Ignoring their experiences isn't objective, it's erasure. For a moment, Miss Carson said nothing, her lips pressed together, as if holding back a retort. She glanced around the room, noticing the looks on her students' faces, some surprised, others quietly approving. It was clear that her authority had been shaken. As Daniel returned to his seat, he noticed Sarah giving him a small, encouraging smile. Other students nodded subtly, their silent support giving him strength. He realized that, despite Miss Carson's attempts to undermine him, he had begun to make an impact, not just in standing up for himself, but in inspiring others to question the biases around them. The lesson continued, but the dynamic in the classroom had shifted. Miss Carson's grip on her authority seemed less absolute, and the students, once silent and complicit, now seemed more aware of the injustice they had witnessed. For Daniel, this was just the beginning of a long fight, but it was a fight he was ready to face head on. As the days went by, the tension in the classroom only grew thicker. Miss Carson's dismissive remarks and pointed criticisms of Daniel became more frequent, each comment an attempt to undermine his confidence. But Daniel held his ground, determined not to show weakness. One day, during a discussion on the broader impacts of social movements, Daniel raised his hand to contribute. Miss Carson, who had been avoiding calling on him unless absolutely necessary, reluctantly nodded in his direction. "Movements like the Civil Rights Movement," Daniel began, his voice steady, "weren't just about changing laws. They were about changing mindsets, challenging systems that dehumanized people, and inspiring other struggles for justice around the world." Before he could elaborate further, Miss Carson interrupted. "Daniel, while that's an interesting perspective, you seem to have a habit of veering into oversimplifications. Perhaps you should stick to facts rather than abstract interpretations?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, while others smirked, entertained by the ongoing power struggle. Sarah, sitting a few rows ahead, frowned but remained silent. Daniel took a deep breath. "With respect, Miss Carson, facts don't exist in a vacuum. The historical record reflects the lived experiences of people, and interpreting those experiences is part of understanding history." A few murmurs rippled through the classroom, and Miss Carson's expression tightened. "That may be your view," she said icily, "but as your teacher, I'm telling you to focus on what's documented, not what you think it means." Daniel didn't respond this time. He met her gaze for a moment, then nodded curtly and sat back down. The class moved on, but the air was thick with unspoken words. After class, Sarah approached Daniel as he packed his books. "That was unfair," she said quietly. "You were making a valid point and she just shut you down." Daniel looked up, surprised. Sarah had never directly addressed him about the tension in the class before. "Thanks," he said. "But it's not about fairness anymore. She's made up her mind about me." "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But that doesn't mean the rest of us have." She hesitated, then added, "A lot of us see what's happening. It's not right." Daniel gave her a small smile. "Thanks, that means a lot." As the weeks continued, Daniel noticed subtle shifts in the classroom dynamic. While some students still remained silent or amused by the conflict, others began to show quiet signs of support, nodding during his contributions, asking him for input during group work, or simply offering a kind word after class. The once lonely battle began to feel a little less isolating. But Miss Carson didn't relent. Her critiques became sharper, her attempts to discredit him more blatant. Each confrontation only fueled Daniel's resolve to persevere. He started documenting her behavior, quietly keeping a record of the incidents. He also began speaking with a few trusted classmates, including Sarah, about what he could do to address the situation more formally. Daniel knew he couldn't change Miss Carson's mindset overnight, but he could stand up for himself and, hopefully, make the classroom a place where respect and fairness mattered more than power and prejudice. "Clearly now the kind of classroom environment you've created," he paused, letting his words sink in, before continuing with calm but unmistakable authority. "Miss Carson, your comments have revealed more about your own biases than about my son's behavior or academic performance. From what I've observed and from what Daniel has shared, it seems you've been treating him unfairly, singling him out, and undermining his efforts in front of the class. That is not the kind of teaching or leadership we expect at Maplewood High." Miss Carson's face turned pale as she realized the gravity of the situation. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The confidence and arrogance she'd displayed earlier were gone, replaced by an expression of sheer panic. Mr. White continued, his tone steady but firm. "As educators, our responsibility is to inspire and support our students, not diminish or belittle them. Your approach, particularly with regard to Daniel, has been both unprofessional and unacceptable. It's clear that there are deeper issues here, and those will need to be addressed immediately." Miss Carson finally managed to speak, her voice trembling. "Principal White, I wasn't aware of—" Mr. White held up a hand, cutting her off politely but decisively. "Miss Carson, this isn't about whether or not you were aware of who Daniel's father is. This is about your actions and the impact they've had on him and the other students in your classroom. There is no excuse for the behavior you've demonstrated." The room fell silent as Mr. White straightened, his presence commanding. "I will be conducting a thorough review of this matter, and you can expect to have a follow-up meeting with me soon. In the meantime, I suggest you take some time to reflect on how you've been handling your responsibilities as a teacher." Miss Carson nodded weakly, her earlier bravado completely shattered. As Mr. White turned to leave, he paused and added, "And for the record, Daniel isn't just a capable student, he's also a resilient young man who has shown remarkable patience and maturity under your treatment. That's something you should have recognized, regardless of who his father is." With that, Mr. White walked out of the office, leaving Miss Carson standing there, her confidence crumbled, and her future at Maplewood High uncertain. Miss Carson stood frozen, unable to respond. The smugness that once defined her demeanor faded, replaced by a visible shift in her expression to one of anxiety and discomfort. She hadn't realized that she had been unjustly treating the son of the school's principal, and now all of her actions were being exposed to the person with the most power at Maplewood High. "We'll be having a much longer conversation about your behavior in class," Mr. White said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "For now, I suggest you return to your classroom and reflect on what has transpired. I'll be observing your teaching methods tomorrow." Miss Carson, her confidence shattered, could only nod as she left the office, her face pale with shock and dread. The weight of the consequences she was about to face hung over her like a storm cloud. The news of the meeting spread quickly through the school, though the specifics remained unclear. Everyone knew something significant had happened. The atmosphere in the history class shifted noticeably, with students whispering to each other, speculating about what would unfold next with Miss Carson, who had once seemed so untouchable, so sure of her authority. When the bell rang for class, the students entered quietly. Miss Carson stood at the front of the room as usual, but her imposing, cold demeanor had been replaced by an unmistakable unease. Her attempts to appear composed fell flat, as her rigid posture and anxious eyes gave away her true feelings. Students like Sarah, sitting at the front, exchanged curious glances, sensing the tension. Once everyone was settled, the door opened, and Thomas White, the principal, stepped into the room. His presence was commanding. The students fell silent, all recognizing that his appearance meant something important was about to happen. Mr. White scanned the room, briefly glancing at Daniel, then turning his attention to Miss Carson, who stood frozen with nervous anticipation. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Today I'll be observing Miss Carson's class. I expect you all to proceed as usual." The class grew even quieter, the tension palpable. No one dared to speak. Miss Carson nodded in response, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Principal White," she said, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. She turned toward the board and attempted to continue the lesson, but the atmosphere had shifted. The students felt it. Mr. White's presence had altered the dynamics of the room. Ms. Carson stammered through her lecture, occasionally mixing up concepts. Her usual commanding presence had vanished, and she appeared flustered and unsure, her authority crumbling before the students. The moment of tension peaked when Daniel raised his hand, as he often did, to participate in the class discussion. In the past, Miss Carson had deliberately ignored him or dismissed his contributions with snide remarks, but today, with Mr. White watching from the back of the room, she could no longer avoid him. After a moment of hesitation, Miss Carson bit her lip and reluctantly called on him. "All right, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "What do you want to say about today's lesson?" Daniel stood, his eyes steady and determined. He had been preparing for this moment and was ready to express his thoughts without fear of ridicule. "I think we can't discuss the civil rights movement without acknowledging the deep impact of racial injustice on society," he said. These injustices didn't just affect Black Americans at the time. They shaped the entire nation. The class was silent, all eyes on Daniel, waiting to see how Miss Carson would react. In the past, she would have interrupted him, belittled his perspective. But today, under Mr. White's watchful gaze, she couldn't do that. She shifted uncomfortably in her stance, her face tense as she searched for a response. "Yes, perhaps you have a point," she said, her voice strained, as she struggled to maintain a neutral tone. The class was stunned. This was the first time Miss Carson had actually listened to Daniel and acknowledged one of his points. The students exchanged looks of surprise, and for the first time they saw a teacher who seemed unsure, even vulnerable, in the face of something bigger than her authority. Without immediately dismissing it, Daniel sat down, exchanging a brief glance with his father, who was seated at the back of the room. Mr. White gave a slight nod to his son, a small but significant gesture. It was a sign of recognition for Daniel's perseverance and courage. He had overcome the obstacles Miss Carson had put in his path and proved that his voice deserved to be heard. But the story didn't end there. After the class ended, Mr. White asked Miss Carson to stay behind. He waited until all the students had left before approaching her. The tension in the room was thick, and Miss Carson knew she was about to face the consequences of her actions. "Mr. Carson," Mr. White began, his voice calm but filled with authority, "I observed your teaching today, and I noticed several areas that need improvement. In particular, I want to address the way you've been treating students, especially Daniel." Miss Carson lowered her head, unable to meet Mr. White's gaze. "I'm sorry, Principal White. I didn't know Daniel was your son," she said, her voice filled with regret. Mr. White shook his head. "Miss Carson, the issue isn't whether or not you knew Daniel was my son. The issue is how you treated a student simply because he dared to express his thoughts, and because he's different. You've shown clear bias and prejudice in your classroom, and that is unacceptable for any educator." His words struck like a judgment, and Miss Carson's nerves heightened. She couldn't defend her actions, knowing she had been in the wrong. "We will be discussing the necessary steps to address this situation," Mr. White continued. "But I want you to understand one thing. In this school, there is no place for discrimination, whether it's subtle or blatant. Every student has the right to be respected, heard, and treated fairly, regardless of their race, background, or beliefs." Miss Carson remained silent, unable to offer a defense. She knew her career was now hanging by a thread, and the consequences of her actions would not be easily swept aside. After the tense conversation with Principal Thomas White, Miss Carson left the classroom feeling heavy-hearted. The confidence and authority she had always projected in front of her students had completely vanished, replaced by anxiety and fear. She realized that Mr. White would not let her actions slide, and that the consequences wouldn't end with just a reprimand. The weight of what she had done began to sink in, and she feared the impact it could have on her career. When Miss Carson returned to class the next day, the atmosphere had completely changed. The students, who had once been cautious and even fearful of her, now looked at her differently. Some, like Sarah in the front row, exchanged knowing glances with Daniel and a few other students. There was a shared understanding between them. They had realized what had been happening all along, the injustice Daniel had been enduring. Miss Carson stood at the front of the class, trying to regain her confidence, but the nervousness was clear in her shaky movements. She began her lesson, but her voice lacked the strength and control it once had. The students sat quietly, not out of fear, but because they could feel the shift in power. Miss Carson's authority was slowly slipping away. The tension in the room became even more apparent when Daniel, with calm but resolute eyes, once again raised his hand to participate. For Daniel, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He no longer feared Miss Carson. His father, Mr. White, had shown him that no one had the right to silence him because of his differences. This time, Miss Carson couldn't ignore him. She had no choice but to call on Daniel. But her voice was filled with apprehension. "All right, Daniel, what would you like to contribute to today's lesson?" she asked, her voice shaky, as if dreading what was about to unfold. Daniel stood up confidently, his voice strong. "I'd like to continue our discussion on the injustices of the civil rights movement that we talked about yesterday," he began. "I believe we can't overlook the far-reaching impact of racial inequality on society. This is an essential part of understanding history and its effects on the present." Once again, the class fell silent. The tension was thick as all eyes turned toward Miss Carson. In the past, she would have immediately mocked or cut off Daniel's comments. But now she couldn't do that. She was forced to sit and listen. Her eyes widened with discomfort as she realized the power she once wielded over her students had now completely shifted. The sharp words she had once used like a weapon were now impotent. After Daniel finished speaking, Mr. Thomas White, who had been observing from the back of the room, stood up and walked to the front. He looked around the class before turning to Miss Carson, his gaze stern. "Students," Mr. White began, his voice calm but commanding, "I want you all to understand that school is not just a place to learn facts and knowledge. It's also where we learn how to treat each other with respect and fairness. What has been happening in this classroom goes against the values our school stands for." He paused for a moment, ensuring his message was clear before continuing. Then he turned to Miss Carson, his voice growing more serious. "Miss Carson, based on what I've observed and what I've heard from the students, it's clear that your behavior in this class has been unacceptable for an educator. You've used your position to impose your personal biases and authority over your students, particularly Daniel. This cannot be tolerated in any classroom." The room was so silent that you could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on Miss Carson, who had gone pale, struggling to maintain her composure. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but no words came out. She knew there was no way out. Everything was now laid bare. "I will not allow any student in this school to be subjected to discrimination, whether subtle or overt," Mr. White continued, his voice growing stronger. "We teach our students that everyone has value, regardless of their race, background, or beliefs. As teachers, we must set the example for showing respect and fairness." Mrs. Carson lowered her head, unable to look up. She knew her career was at an end. What she had done to Daniel wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation of the basic principles of fairness and respect that the school represented. Mr. White turned back to the students, his tone softening as he addressed them once more. "I hope you've learned an important lesson from this situation," he said. "Always stand up for what's right, respect one another, and never be afraid to speak out against injustice." After his speech, Mr. White turned to Miss Carson with finality. "I expect you to gather your things and leave the classroom immediately. We'll be discussing this further with the school board, but I believe the decision has already been made." Miss Carson stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. She knew it was over. There was no more authority, no more control, only defeat and regret. She silently gathered her teaching materials and quickly left the classroom. The students watched her departure in stunned silence. As Miss Carson left, the atmosphere in the classroom lightened noticeably. The students exchanged glances, almost in disbelief, at what had just happened. Sarah turned to Daniel and smiled softly. She knew that Daniel had won this battle, not just for himself, but for all the students in the class. A few others began to smile as well, and the tension in the room dissipated. Daniel sat down, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, after days of tension and depression, he had overcome the toughest challenge. He hadn't just stood up for himself, he had made a real change in how people thought about fairness and respect. After Miss Carson left the classroom, the atmosphere shifted drastically. The tension and injustice that had once hung over the class were gone, replaced by a sense of relief and freedom that the students hadn't experienced before. They began talking to each other about what had just happened, exchanging glances filled with understanding and realization that they had witnessed something significant. Not just a shift in teaching, but a shift in attitudes toward fairness and respect. Daniel sat quietly in the corner of the room, feeling the change in the air. He didn't feel triumphant over Miss Carson's departure. What he felt was a deep sense of accomplishment. After days of being oppressed and treated unfairly, he had finally been recognized. The other students also began to realize what Daniel had gone through, and they felt a growing sense of empathy and even admiration for him. After class ended, as Daniel was getting ready to leave, Sarah, who had always sat in the front, quietly observing, approached him. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but finally sighed and spoke softly. "Daniel, I just wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier," she said. "I knew what Miss Carson was doing was wrong, but I was scared. I didn't know how to help you." Daniel looked up and smiled gently. "Thank you, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice filled with understanding. "I get it. Standing up against injustice isn't easy, but just the fact that you understand and are willing to change means a lot." Sarah nodded, feeling relieved after saying what had been on her mind. "I hope from now on we can do something to change the school. Maybe we need a space where everyone can share their views, a place where everyone's voice can be heard." Daniel agreed with her suggestion. He had thought about creating an environment where all students, regardless of race or background, could feel like they had a voice. "I agree," he said. "We should start a club or discussion group where students can share their opinions and experiences. We need to create change within the school so no one feels overlooked or treated unfairly anymore." Daniel's words sparked a new sense of purpose among the students around him. Ideas about promoting diversity and inclusion began to flow. Not just Sarah, but several other students approached Daniel and started sharing their thoughts. A small group of students began to form, all with the same goal, to make the school a place where everyone was respected and had a voice. The next day, when Daniel arrived at school, he noticed a clear change. The students who had once stood on the sidelines now began to approach him and greet him. They no longer looked at him with curious or distant eyes, but instead with respect and recognition. A few students had already begun discussing forming a club for inclusion where everyone could talk about issues related to discrimination and unfair treatment. At lunchtime, Daniel was invited to sit with a group of students he hadn't interacted with before. They began asking him about his feelings after what had happened with Miss Carson and shared their thoughts on the changes that were needed at the school. "I think we should have a seminar on diversity," a student named James suggested. "Maybe invite outside speakers to talk about how to confront discrimination in society." "That's a great idea," Daniel replied. "I think opening up conversations like that will help us all understand each other better, not just about race, but about how we can support each other in every aspect of life." The discussion continued and more students joined in, bringing their ideas and suggestions, from diversifying the curriculum to include more works from different cultures, to creating mentoring programs for minority students. The plans began to take shape. Everyone agreed that change was necessary, and they all committed to working together to make the school a more inclusive and respectful place. As the final bell rang at the end of the day, Daniel left the classroom with a new sense of hope. He knew that his fight wasn't just about facing Miss Carson. It was the beginning of a much longer journey to change the way the entire student community thought. And the most important thing was that he no longer had to fight alone. He now had new friends and allies who shared his ideals and determination. On his way out of the school, Daniel met up with his father, Thomas White, who was waiting for him by the school gate. They walked together in silence, but both understood what was going on in each other's minds. Mr. White looked at Daniel with pride. "You know, Daniel," he said, "you've done something that not many people have the courage to do. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you've opened the door for so many other students. I'm proud of you." Daniel nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," he replied. "But I just hope that the changes I'm helping to make will last. There are so many people out there who still face injustice every day, and we can't let that continue." Mr. White agreed, patting Daniel gently on the shoulder. "You're right. Change never comes easily, but you've shown everyone that it's possible, as long as we don't give up." As Daniel looked back at the school one more time, he felt proud of what he had accomplished and determined to continue on the path he had started. He knew the journey would be long, but with the support of his community, friends, and family, he no longer had to walk it alone. The events at Maplewood High School had shown that discrimination and injustice can exist anywhere, even in modern academic settings. But more importantly, they had shown that with courage, persistence, and determination, people like Daniel can create real change. Schools are not just places for learning knowledge, but also for learning how to live, how to respect each other, and how to build a more just community. The end of the story isn't just a personal victory, but the beginning of a larger journey, a journey that everyone, from students to teachers, commits to walking together to create a place where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, has the opportunity to thrive and succeed.